Is reality actually a hallucination? That's what we're going to be taking a look at today. Now, before we can answer the question of if reality itself is a hallucination, we have to know something about the brain and how the brain relates to consciousness, sentience, and what we are as minds. So we have to take a look at the brain and how that plays a factor into what we're talking about today, and understanding how the brain operates and works and what brain filter theory is. And then we'll be able to take a look and see if this reality is itself a shared hallucination, because this is going to depend on the purpose and function of the brain, which scientific materialists today cannot understand how it's able to generate a subjective experience, sentience, and consciousness. And this is incredibly important. And to be able to understand this a little better, I want to bring your attention to an article on this website called mindmatters.ai, which is a really great website. I highly recommend it. They have fantastic articles. Now, this article is called "Is Consciousness a Controlled Brain Hallucination?" We're going to need to understand, like I said, the brain first and how that relates to consciousness and sentience before we can understand reality as a whole. And so this article is written by Michael Egnor. Now, Michael Egnor is a neurosurgeon. So you can imagine that this individual has a very, very good experience, a lot of experience with working with brains, understanding how brains work, and you'll find it very interesting. Now, I don't agree with Michael Egnor on everything. There's some things I very firmly disagree with with Michael Egnor, but Michael Egnor believes that the brain cannot explain mind, sentience, and consciousness. And he believes that reality cannot just be matter and material alone. That reality is either a dualism or an idealism. A dualism means that there is a substance called matter and a substance called mind. And then idealism is the idea that all reality is mind and that matter is just an illusion. And that is our position. That is my position. It is an idealism. The fact that matter is actually an illusion, and that what we are and everything is truly mind, and matter is just mind that's represented in a certain way, an externalized way, an experiential way with related to space and time. Now, this is all very, very important. And let's first jump into this idea here. So philosopher, then this is by said Michael Egnor. Philosopher David Chalmers famously divided the problem of understanding how consciousness is related to the brain by distinguishing between the easy and hard problems of consciousness. So let's just read the easy problem, which is not really related to what we're talking about here, but just for completeness' sake. The easy problem of consciousness is typically faced by working neuroscientists. That is, what parts of the brain are metabolically active when we're awake? What kind of neurons are involved in memory? Now, these problems are easy only in the sense that they are tractable. The neuroscience necessary to answer them is challenging, but with enough skill and perseverance, it can be done. So this is really important. What does that mean? What the soft problem of consciousness is just about sort of mapping the activity in the brain to different thought processes. So like they said, what parts of the brain are active when we're awake? What kind of neurons are involved in memory? So mapping different brain processes with mental functions. And this is an easy problem, not because it's easy to do, actually. It's a very difficult thing to do, but it's easy in that it is possible, that it's very challenging, but that it can be done. With enough time and technology and work, we could figure out what areas of the brain correspond with different mental functions, different thoughts, different things that we do internally. But the hard problem of consciousness, now this is something different, okay? Now this is very important to everything what we're talking about today, about hallucinating reality, how the brain interacts with the mind, and all this. The hard problem of consciousness is another matter entirely. It is this: how can first-person subjective experience arise from brain matter? Now, this is really important. Most people don't understand this, and this is critical. Okay, so the soft problem is just about mapping correspondences. When we think about something, what part of the brain lights up, becomes active? That's the soft. The hard problem is, how does an inner subjective experience arise at all? How does that come about at all? It's not about mapping or finding correspondences. It's about how is it that subjective experience is possible? This is the hard problem of consciousness. How can first-person subjective experience arise from brain matter? How do we get an I, your internal subjective experience of what you are, from an it, a lump of organic matter, a brain? Compared with the easy problem, the hard problem is, from the perspective of materialist neuroscience, intractable. So, what this means here, what we're talking about here, the easy problem is, yeah, it's very challenging, but it can be done. The hard problem, from a materialist perspective, is impossible. It can't be done. And this is really critical to understand, because it's both an easy concept and a difficult concept in understanding it. Most people have been just grown up with the idea that, oh, the brain generates the mind, the brain generates the mind, the brain generates the mind. You've been sort of pounded, this has been pounded into you since birth. So no one really questions it and no one really thinks about it. A lot of people take it for granted and they never even spend time trying to understand it because it's just been dogmatically pounded into you. The brain generates your mind. And a lot of people think, oh, well, when certain parts of the brain are damaged, this can interfere with, different mental functions. So it seems like, hey, this checks out. But what we need to understand, and understanding this is critical for everything we're going to talk about. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time really breaking this down. Because again, it's a concept that is both easy and difficult to understand. Easy because it's conceptually easy. Difficult because it's been so dogmatically pounded into our heads since birth that it's hard for people to think in a different way. But first of all, think about it like this. You right now are having an internal, subjective, sentient experience. You're having an internal experience. There's an internality to it. You feel the wind on your face. You feel the pressure of the seat that you're sitting on. You feel the phone that you're holding. You can feel happy. You can feel sad. You can feel hope. You can feel despair. You can feel pain. You can feel pleasure. You can see all the different colors and shapes around you. You have a living, internal, subjective experience. Okay? Now, obviously that's the case, but it's really important. All right, just put that on hold for a while. Remember that. Now, if you look at, let's say, another person, you know that person, you're looking at another person's body. You know that person is also having an internal subjective experience like you. Now, you can't see it. You can't touch it. You can't taste it. You can't feel it. You can't touch, taste, feel, or smell their subjective experience. But you know that they're having one. And you're having one. And likewise, no one can see or experience your internal experience. It's yours. Now, think about something like a rock. If you look at a rock, from now let's take the perspective of materialism, the idea that there's only matter and matter is the only thing that exists, right? So from that paradigm, if you look at a rock, well, a rock is just inert. It's all external. It has no internal property. There's no subjective experience to be a rock. That rock doesn't feel anything. It doesn't have any hopes or dreams, doesn't feel sad or happiness. It doesn't, detect light and dark. There is absolutely, according to, the materialist paradigm of science and empiricism, materialism, that rock is just pure externality, no internality whatsoever. Okay? And I think most people can understand that and get that idea. So what's really important to understand here is the difference between an inert rock that has external properties but no internality, just lifeless matter, and then that internal subjective experience that you are having right now. Now, one needs to just really understand that this internal subjective experience that you're having right now is different than, let's say, a rock, a lump of matter. They're different. They're not the same thing. They are different things. You can touch, taste, smell, and hear a rock. If you drop it or touch it, feel it, smell it, whatever. You can do all that. You can't touch, taste, hear, smell, or whatnot, someone's internal experience. Neither can they do yours. And there's a huge qualitative difference between the external properties of a rock and your internal subjective experience. Okay, now the reason why I'm really pounding that in and trying to emphasize this, and to a lot of people that might seem obvious, but here's the idea. The hard problem of consciousness is that how can material matter give rise to an internal subjective experience? And because that's what is posited, that a brain, which is nothing but matter, that a brain somehow gives rise to that internal subjective experience that we are having right now. Now, it's important to understand that this is impossible. Now, the reason why this is impossible is, again, according to materialist science, what is matter? Matter is a mind-independent substance. It's something that can exist without mind. Matter is primary, mind isn't. Things can exist without mind. It's a mind-independent substance. So to really understand why that a brain cannot generate mind and consciousness and sentience, we need to really break this down. And Leibniz understood this with his thought experiment called Leibniz's mill. But the idea here is people kind of get mystified by the brain because the brain is very complex. It's an extremely complex, the most complex thing that evolution has produced. And it, has neurons firing and all these different synapses and electrical impulses and whatnot. It's extremely complex, very intricate. So because it's so complex, because it's so intricate, people kind of have this idea that, oh, well, somehow along the way, it generated an internal subjective experience. But that's a problem. That's not actually, people get sort of mystified because of the brain's complexity, somehow thinking that it can generate an internal subjective experience. But it can't, because if you look at matter is matter, right? Everything is made up of electrons, quarks, and they compose atoms, which compose molecules. A rock and your brain are both matter. The difference is in the complexity of it, but not in the substance of what it is. It's still matter. One is just very, very basic, and one is more complex. But it doesn't matter how complex a material structure is, there's no way for it to be able to generate an internal experience. Because remember, they are very, very different things. And a material object that has only external properties with no internality whatsoever can never, ever, ever generate an internal subjective experience, no matter how complicated. Why? Because they are different things. Some people might get this right away, but for others, I'm trying to go over it because so many people have a hard time understanding, like, even what the question of the hard problem of consciousness is and why it is so difficult. Most scientists they don't really get it either because they're not used to thinking in these philosophical ways or outside the materialist paradigm. But imagine, if you take and this is why AI can never generate an internal subjective experience either, because computers are ultimately matter as well, from the materialist paradigm especially. And it doesn't matter how complex you form matter, it can never generate that internal experience. To put it in a really crude, this is a bad example, but to put it in a really crude way to get it across, it doesn't matter. Let's say you got a bunch of rocks. It doesn't matter how you arrange the rocks. It's never going to generate an internal subjective experience. And that should be obvious to you, right? And this might even sound kind of dumb or silly, but just go with it. If you have tons of rocks and you arrange all these rocks in a certain way, complicated way, well, that's never going to generate an internal subjective experience, right? No, of course not. That'd be crazy. Well, let's say you add electricity to it. You electrify the rocks. Is that going to generate internal? No, of course not, because the electricity just has to do with electrons, which is also matter in the sense of materialist science. So of course you're not going to, because that's silly. You're obviously never going to get an internal experience from rocks, no matter how complicated they are. Well, now imagine that you chisel these rocks into intricate components of a computer. Let's say you don't just get rocks either, but you get plastics and you get everything that you need to make a computer. You take all this material, you use all the processes need from these rocks and plastics and ores and metals and whatnot, and you create computer chips and complicated computers, and generate from that a sophisticated AI. Well, that can never generate an internal experience because you're just putting matter in different formations. The brain is the same way. The brain is just matter in a certain form, in a certain complex structure, but it can't generate an internal experience any more than arranging rocks in a certain way could generate an internal experience. You cannot do it. All right, so that's really very extremely important to understand. And if you can understand that, awesome, because most people can't. They can't even begin to understand this. If you're having a hard time struggling with it, don't feel bad, because it's a very difficult subject that most scientists don't even grasp. So and this relates to reality being a hallucination and all this and the function of the brain. So let's continue here. So Michael Egnor, the neurosurgeon, says the hard problem of consciousness is another matter entirely. It's how can first-person subjective experience arise from brain matter? How do we get an internality from just a lump of matter? So the hard problem is, from the perspective of materialist neuroscience, intractable. This is an impossibility. So many neuroscientists evade the hard problem by denying its relevance to neuroscience. In a recent essay, leading neuroscientist Anil Seth, co-director of the Sackler Center for Conscious Science at University of Sussex in Brighton, eschews the easy hard problem distinction. So there's so much I want to talk about today. I'm going to go over some of this stuff kind of fast, all right? But this is a quote by Anil Seth. The rise of modern neuroscience has been a more pragmatic approach, an approach that is guided by philosophy but doesn't rely on philosophical research to provide the answer. Its key is to recognize that explaining why consciousness exists at all is not necessary in order to make progress in revealing its material basis. To start building explanatory bridges from the subjective and phenomenal to the objective and measurable. In my own research, a new picture is taking shape in which conscious experience is seen as deeply grounded in how brains work and how bodies work together to maintain physiological integrity to stay alive. In this story, we are conscious beast machines, and I hope to show you why. So basically, Anil Seth is trying to solve the whole hard problem of consciousness by taking a look at ourselves as being this integrated body-brain system working to maintain physiological integrity. And if some of this sounds a little wordy, I'm going to explain it in a moment. So Egnor asks, so how is it that we conscious beast machines are conscious? So Michael Egnor's not buying it. How is it that we as beast machines, as this person is saying, how are we conscious? So Anil Seth attempts to answer this by saying, to answer this, we can appeal to the same process that underlies other forms of perception. The brain makes its best guess based on prior beliefs or expectations and the available sensory data. In this case, the relevant sensory data includes signals specific to the body, as well as the classic senses, such as vision and touch. These bodily senses include proprioception, which signals the body's configuration in space, and interoception, which involves a raft of inputs that convey information from inside the body, such as blood pressure, gastric tension, heartbeat, so on. The experience of embodied selfhood depends on predictions about body-related causes of sensory signals across interoceptive, and proprioceptive channels, as well as across the classic senses. Our experience of being and having a body are controlled hallucinations of a very distinctive kind. Now, here's where we're going to get into some really important stuff. So Michael Egnor responds, there's a lot more to say to Seth's rather verbose essay, but the essence of his theory of consciousness is that the brain integrates a cacophony of sensory inputs to fabricate an explanation for perceived reality, a controlled hallucination that we call consciousness. This view that consciousness is, in one sense or another, the consequence of massive parallel processing goes on in neural circuits in the brain is common among modern neuroscientists, but it can't be true. This is important. Okay, so just to break this down, what is Anil Seth saying? Anil Seth is saying basically consciousness is a hallucination, a controlled hallucination that results from massive parallel processing in neural circuits in the brain. So it's again, more of the basic way that modern materialist science more or less thinks it's still consciousness is emerging from somehow the brain's processes. Now, we already saw that that's not possible. So this individual isn't even really giving an answer to how it's possible, because you see how people don't really understand the answer. If you're saying that consciousness is a controlled hallucination, you still have to give how it's possible for this hallucination to generate. Why do you have any internality whatsoever? How? Not even why. Not even why is the wrong question. How? How is it possible? If it is a controlled hallucination, how is it possible? Now, what we're going to see is that this is entirely incorrect. It's not consciousness that is the hallucination. We're going to see that it is actually reality that is the hallucination. In a certain sense, it is actually matter that is the hallucination. In a certain sense. So scientific materialists have got it completely backwards. And I'm going to read you an excerpt as well to give you an idea of what's going on. This is an excerpt from a video on IAI.tv. It says, "We're uncovering a new science of consciousness, a theory that's getting closer to solving the problem of the self once and for all, or at least so claim leading neuroscientists. Some argue the reality we perceive is a controlled hallucination as a best guess to how the world really is. Others that quantum mechanics or multiple levels of brain organization are responsible for consciousness. But critics maintain that these don't get to the heart of the problem, how the material stuff of the brain is responsible for the immaterial stuff of existence. See, everything else is just obscuring the problem. If you start talking about, oh, well, really because of the neural parallel processing of the brain, we get a controlled hallucination, or the complex quantum mechanics on multiple levels of brain organization, or so, you see, that is completely missing the entire point. The question is, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what you're saying about quantum mechanics or the various structures and complexity of the brain levels. Doesn't matter. The question is, if you believe that material matter exists and only matter exists as the primary substance, which is an external qualitative substance that exists independently of mind and has no mental attribute, how can the material stuff of the brain generate the immaterial stuff of experience, the subjective you, the subjective I? That's the question. And you can't appeal to, well, because of the complex structures of, you see, it doesn't matter. It could be infinitely complex. It doesn't matter how complex it is. It is a logical impossibility. It's like saying 2 + 2 = 64. It doesn't matter how complicated you do your math. You're not going to be able to justify a logical impossibility, a mathematical impossibility. So you cannot say that the brain can somehow generate an internal subjective experience because it's very complex. It's a literal logical impossibility. It cannot happen. And no materialist has ever proposed any kind of mechanism that could do it, because you can't propose a mechanism for it to do. Do you see the problem? It's within the paradigm itself is broken. It makes no room for internal subjective experience. So, and this is going to be, again, this all relates to what we're talking about today. So now, Michael Egnor, the neurosurgeon, is continuing basically to see why Anil Seth's answer is bullshit, basically. Consider the neurological consequences of split brain surgery, and the congenital brain condition called hydranencephaly. So in split brain surgery, neurosurgeons cut the massive bundles of nerve fibers connecting the cerebral hemispheres in order to lessen the propagation of seizures in patients with epilepsy. So the two brain hemispheres are disconnected, and information from one hemisphere cannot readily be transmitted to the other. This radical disconnection of the brain hemispheres causes massive interference with sensory signals across interoceptive and proprioceptive channels, as well as across the classical senses. But contrary to what Seth's theories seem to predict, there is no impairment of consciousness whatsoever. Patients with split brains, I have performed the surgery myself, Michael says, have very subtle perceptual disabilities of which they are almost always unaware, and there is no impairment in consciousness. So basically, and he continues, neuroscientist Yair Pinto calls the split brain state divided perception, but undivided consciousness. So basically, if you divide the brain, you would think that you would get a divided consciousness, but you don't. You still have a unified subjective experience. Now, you can have your perception of things can be different, but there is still a singular, undivided you. One quick thing I want to say real quick. I'm not going to go on about this for too long because you who watch me know this is a pet peeve of mine. In physics, neuroscience, philosophy, modern philosophy, consciousness is used incorrectly. What they mean is sentience. Now, in psychology, they use this correct all the time because they understand that there's a difference between consciousness and the unconscious. When they're talking about consciousness in this article and many articles in physics, when they say consciousness, they mean sentience because they're talking about just the you, the I, just the ability to have experience of any kind whatsoever. The ability to have any kind of experience whatsoever. That's sentience. The ability to experience qualia, to feel heat, cold, sadness, pain, whatever. Just having experience, that is sentience. And that's what they mean. Consciousness is a more complex structure of mind that is self-awareness. Because consciousness involves things that you are consciously aware of. Oh, I am an I, and I know that I have to go to the dentist next week, is something that involves consciousness, which is different than sentience. Sentience is just the ability, oh, ow, that hurt. You know that it hurt and felt that pain because you are sentient. So there's a difference between sentience and consciousness. So just know that every time they say consciousness, they actually mean sentience. And I'm not going to continually correct that because it would be annoying and interfere with what we're talking about. But I just want to put that out there in case some people are confused. So it's difficult to reconcile Seth's notion of consciousness, which means sentience, which is just the ability to have, just to be a subjective I. So it's difficult to reconcile Seth's notion of consciousness as a controlled hallucination as a result of massively integrated perceptions with the full preservation of consciousness following cutting the brain hemispheres in half. Consciousness is not, in this circumstance, subject to the scalpel, as Seth's materialist theory implies it must be. So dividing in the brain does not divide consciousness. So an even more intractable problem for Seth's controlled hallucination theory is hydranencephaly. Now, hydranencephaly is a condition in which children are often born without brain hemispheres. The cause is usually a massive intrauterine stroke that destroys all of the brain above the brainstem. Nearly all of the perceptual circuits on which Seth's theory depend are not merely cut, but are completely destroyed. Yet children with hydranencephaly are fully conscious, fully sentient. So even though these children don't have the perceptual circuits, the intricacy that would be proposed to be needed to generate the controlled hallucination of consciousness, these children don't have it. Yet they are sentient, yet they are conscious. I have cared for these children myself. I am a pediatric neurosurgeon. Although they are quite handicapped, they are certainly conscious, interactive, and show a full range of emotions: laughter, crying, glee, fear, and such. Complete destruction of the cerebral hemispheres is fully compatible with consciousness. Seth's theory that that consciousness is a controlled hallucination occasioned by integration of mastery sensory inputs by the brain hemispheres falls apart when we consider that disconnection of the hemispheres and even destruction of the brain hemispheres is compatible with full consciousness, despite profound sensory and motor disabilities. Only a dualist or idealist understanding of the mind-brain relationship can survive the evidence provided by split brain research and routine clinical experience with children with hydranencephaly. The only controlled hallucination here is the belief that materialism can explain the mind. Okay, so now with this understanding, let's take a little closer look at this and then understand the question of is reality itself a hallucination? Because this is all intricately linked. So, this idea that the brain can generate the mind is ridiculous. There's no possible way that it could do so. It's logically, philosophically, rationally an impossibility. A brain can't generate consciousness any more than a rock could generate consciousness. It doesn't have the capacity to do so because it's a mind-independent substance with no internal aspect whatsoever. So, what Michael Egnor says is only a dualist or idealist understanding of the mind-brain relationship can survive the evidence provided by split brain research. So what does this mean? Now notice he's saying the mind-brain relationship. So a distinction between mind and brain. These are different things. This is important because, again, dogmatically, you've been sort of pummeled since you were born that the brain and the mind are the same thing. Brain, it's the same thing. You can even use them interchangeably usually. But the thing is that they're not. The brain and the mind are different. One is material, the other is immaterial. Now, it doesn't mean it's some like woo-woo mystical substance. This is a system of mathematical frequency, but it is immaterial mathematical frequency in that it does not exist within this domain. Now, I will explain this in just a moment, but it's important here to first off understand the difference between, to just get that what Michael Egnor is saying and that what is agreed here is that the mind and the brain are different. They're not the same. They are different things. And Michael says, based on split brain research and hydranencephaly, materialism, the idea that matter is the only thing that exists, can't explain this. Only a dualist or idealist understanding of the main mind-brain relationship can survive the evidence. So what's the difference? Dualism is the idea that there are two substances, matter and mind. And that matter and mind, they interact with each other. Now, we can show logically that this is impossible. I won't get into the details of it here, but I'll summarize it real quick. The idea that there are two substances, mind and matter, this is known as dualism. It's really popularized by Descartes, but starts off even in Plato. And this suffers from, it's even known as Cartesian dualism sometimes, but it suffers from the substance dualism. Okay, there's an inherent problem if you're going to say that there are two substances, mind and matter. And that problem is, if there are two substances that are completely different from each other in every way, that share no commonality whatsoever, where one can't be reduced to another, there would be no way for the two substances to interact. Because since they share no commonalities, there would be no point of contact, so to speak. It would be kind of like, to be kind of silly about it, but it would be like a ghost trying to pick up a cup from the table. It would just go right through it because they're different things. It's kind of a silly example, but that, in a nutshell, is the problem. The problem of substance dualism. That if there are two things that are absolutely 100% completely different, with no reduction to one to the other, or no commonality, then there's no way for them to interact, and then so you wouldn't have the mind being able to interact with the brain. Now, idealism, which is what I support and what we support, is the idea that all reality is mind and that matter is actually the illusion. Matter is what mind generates and we experience, but that matter is ultimately the illusion. It arises from mind. How? Well, just like when you go to sleep and dream, you create a realm of matter, what you think to be real. So first thing that I want to point out here is that the ability for mind to generate an illusion of matter is already something that we're all familiar with. We experience every time we go to sleep at night and have a dream. Your mind generates the illusion of matter. So we know that the mind has the capacity to do this. We know that it has that capacity. Now, contrary, there is no way that matter can have the capacity to generate the illusion of mind. So you see the difference already. There's no way for this to be able to happen, but we know that mind can generate the illusion of matter every time you go to sleep and dream. Now, dream worlds behave differently from the world that we experience when we're waking, but they have a lot of similarities, and I'll explain why there are differences. So what is, because, all right, so now understanding that mind is primary and matter is all ultimately comes from mind. That means the brain ultimately is a structure of mind. It's not a mind itself, but it is ultimately mind, but mind in a space-time localized transformation. Kind of a silly but easy way to understand this is imagine that mind is water and matter is ice. You can have water transformed into ice and then ice back into water, but it's all ultimately the same substance. Kind of a similar idea going on here. Everything is mind, but it can be transformed into a space-time representation which we experience as matter, or it can be experienced as or it can be mind in and of itself as our internal sentient subjective perceptions. So because everything is ultimately mind and just transformations of mind, matter is a transformation of mind, there's no interaction problem. You have the interaction problem if you think that two things are separate because there's no commonality. But if everything is ultimately at base the same, then there's no interaction problem because it's the same thing interacting with itself, just in a different form. But they have a commonality. That is what they are ultimately at base. So there's no problem with interaction. So what the mind is, it's what you are. We are all eternal minds. And these are systems of mathematical frequencies, sinusoidal waveforms. That's what each and every one of us is. Now, this is defined as mind. Now, the thing to understand here is that the brain is extremely important. But what the brain does and allows us to do is the brain doesn't generate the mind. The mind, what we are as sentient beings, we are eternal. So we've always existed and have always existed. And I've explained how that's possible and why in my other videos, but I won't do so now because that would take too long. But we are eternal. The sentience isn't something that's created. Sentience is something that is eternal. And the problem here, or the misconception is that people have, is that the brain and the mind are the same thing, or that the brain generates the mind, whatever. What the brain does is it conditions and filters the mind. That's what the brain does. It conditions and filters the mind. So what does that mean? It conditions and filters the mind to allow the mind as a non-local entity to experience a localized reality. An easy way to understand this is to think about VR. So let's say you have a VR headset. And if you put this VR headset in, that VR headset is going to limit and condition you in a certain way. Because when you put on that VR headset, you are no longer experiencing the world around you. You're no longer receiving light signals and sight from the world around you. You're only receiving specific information that the VR headset is sending you. So it's limiting and filtering what you are able to experience. You're no longer experiencing all the data that was coming in before. Now you're experiencing only what the VR headset is feeding you. And the VR headset will feed you a specific set of information to give you an experience of the VR world. It's also going to limit you in other ways. Because within that VR world, you are going to be constrained by the rules of that world. Let's say you're playing a video game and you're a certain character. You have certain strengths, certain speeds, certain abilities, certain rules about how you can interact in that world. So the VR system, the headset, the controllers, all that, limits and filters you by restricting a set of information to be given to you to experience a certain kind of world. And it further limits, but it also allows you to interact in that world. You see, that's important as well. It allows you to interact in that world by the controllers and the visual stimulus. You're now able to interact in this world, but according to that world's rules and the information that it's sending to you. Now, if you were born with a VR headset strapped to yourself, you would think that that was the real world. The brain is very similar to a VR headset. You as an eternal mind do not exist within the physical domain of space-time, what we call the holos. You exist in the mental domain, a purely mental domain. When you as a mind connect to a brain or link to a brain, it's like putting on a VR headset. That brain is going to filter and condition you as a mind. You are going to be receiving the input given to you by your eyes, your skin, your tongue, your nose. The brain and body gives you and limits and filters you as a mind to a certain set of perceptions and experiences that allow you, but this allows you to now you're no longer experiencing the pure domain of mind, you're experiencing the space-time world around you, just like putting on that VR headset. It's giving you that information. But you're also limited and constrained by your avatar, your body, but it's also what allows you to interact in this world. This body is what allows you to interact, make changes, etc. And that's why it's important for us to make change, by the way, because that's literally what we're here to do. We're here to transform this world. But that's off topic. This is the apparatus that limits and filters our mind to be able to experience this world and interact in it. Just like a VR headset limits and experiences you and allows you to interact in that world, constrained by that world's rules and the functions of your controllers and your avatar, etc. So the only major difference here is that imagine if you put on the VR headset that you forgot, as soon as you do that, that you forget that the world that you are actually in exists. That's kind of how the brain works, because it's also a filtering and limiting system that has evolved over time for your survival. Your brain doesn't care about making you happy. Your brain doesn't care about showing you the truth of reality. The brain just cares about your survival. So it has filtered out unnecessary data for survival. You don't need to know what an electron is doing on the other side of the universe for your survival. That hinders your survival, because if you have all this information in your head, a predator is going to come over and kill you. So the brain and nervous system and body has specifically been evolved to filter out everything except for what is necessary for survival on this specific and particular planet. So do you see, this is very important to understand that the brain does not generate the mind, and the brain is not the mind, just like you aren't the VR headset. Do you see how silly that would seem? If people thought that, oh, well, VR headsets are you, and the VR headsets generate you. No, of course not. That's very, very silly. But the same thing with the brain. But you can see how there is a correlation, because if you get, if your brain is damaged, well, that's going to limit, you'll have difficulty perhaps thinking in certain ways. You'll have difficulty perhaps moving around or whatever, depending on how your brain is damaged. It'll affect your mobility or mental functioning. Now, some people will be like, well, see, that means that the brain is the mind. No. Because imagine that one of your VR headset gets damaged and one of the lenses gets cracked or completely destroyed. Well, your vision is going to be completely limited. Imagine that one of your controller, your left controller completely breaks. You're not going to be able to use half your abilities anymore. So you can see that there is a correlation, but it doesn't mean that one generates the other. So when your brain gets damaged, yes, there's going to be a correlation between your abilities to interact, because that's what specifically the brain does. And it's going to be limiting the data that it is sending to you. So it's very important to understand that it's a very, very silly, illogical, and fallacious thing to think that the brain is a generator of the mind. It is not. And this is why when Michael Egnor talks about split brain research and hydranencephaly. Yeah, it does affect certain functioning, but it doesn't destroy consciousness, sentience, subjective experience itself. So this is what is extremely important to understand with regard to the brain and the mind. So it's important to know that sentience is not the hallucination. That's what people are, science pretty much wants to say that you as an individual mind, that's all what you are. You're just a hallucination. You don't really exist. You're just like this illusion that a brain generates. You're not really, you don't really matter. You're just this epiphenomenon of matter. It's just this, your hopes, your dreams, your love, all that. That's just an illusion. It doesn't matter. No, all that is what is primary and what matters. Everything else is just a function of that and a transformation of that. You aren't the hallucination. You, as your eternal essence, is what is real. Now, the question is, though, is the converse true? Is reality itself a hallucination? And this is the very, very interesting question, because this depends on, well, what do you mean by a hallucination? So, would you? So let me give you an example here. The definition of a hallucination is a perception of something that isn't present. Okay, so that's what a hallucination is: a perception of something that isn't there. So let me ask you: if you put on a VR headset, is that VR headset world that you're experiencing, is that VR world a hallucination? Well, it's very there for you, and it's there. The data is very real. The signals are being sent to you. Those are real, and those are there. But is the VR world itself there? Well, to people looking at you, moving around in weird ways and interacting with objects that aren't there, it would seem like you're hallucinating. But for everyone else in that VR world that's in there with you, it would look normal. They would be able to see, like you're playing a multiplayer game. They're able to see what you're interacting with. They see that you're interacting with things that are there in that VR world. So is that VR world real, or is it a hallucination? And are those people in that VR world hallucinating with you, or are they taking part in something that is real? So let's put it another way. Let's say that you are dreaming. When you're dreaming, are you having a hallucination, or is that dream world real? Well, what does one mean by real? Again, hallucination is the experience of something that's not there. Well, it's there for you, but it's not there for anyone else. Now, think about, let's say that someone is awake and having hallucination. They see the hallucination of an apple on the table. They're hallucinating. They see an apple on the table, and you go, oh, that person is hallucinating. Well, are they? For them, that apple is there. I mean, not in a physical, tangible way, but at least the visual perception of it, that's there. They're receiving signals that tell them that an apple is there. So is that apple there? Well, you would want to say, well, no, that's a hallucination. Well, what if two people were having the exact same hallucination? Would you want to say that they're hallucinating? Well, you still kind of want to, well, yeah, they're hallucinating. That apple isn't there. I don't see it. They don't see it. Well, what if 3 people see it? What if 10 people see it? What if 1,000 people see it? What if 1,000,000 people see it? What if 1,000,000,000 people see it? What if everyone saw it? Well, if everyone saw it, it'd be like, well, what is this thing? There is this thing that we all see that's here. We need to study it. We need to find out how this exists. How does this apple that, our hand goes through, how is it? It's there. We all see it. How does it exist? So do you see, hallucination is a very fuzzy and vague concept that actually depends on how many people are involved in the hallucination. Meaning that what we decide, what we confer as or assume to be real, is dependent upon how many people are taking part in the hallucination. Meaning that you can see reality as a collectively agreed upon hallucination. Because we are all having the experience of this existence that is here, but we are only doing so because our apparatus, our brains, our physical apparatus is sending us signals telling us that certain things are where they are, how they feel, etc. How they smell, how they taste. That is all being sent to us by these signals. And because all of us are being sent these signals, we're experiencing the same thing. And so we collectively agree that is real. If someone has signals of something that none of us are having signals receiving, well, I mean, they're receiving the signals, it's real for them, but it's not real for us. So we would say that that person is hallucinating. So the question is this a hallucination? Well, it depends on what you define as a hallucination. We can call this a collectively agreed upon hallucination, which makes something real. So we could call something real as being a collectively agreed upon hallucination. Now, if we can really understand this, and I talk about this on, we have different phases of human evolution. There's the survival phase, the planetary civilization phase, and then the planetary independence phase. Right now, humanity is in the survival phase. Our goal is to get humanity to the next stage, which is the stage of planetary civilization, where we understand what we are, where we are, why we're here. We begin to build a society reflecting our own growth and experience and building a better quality of life for each other with the understanding of what reality is. That's where we want to get humanity. But there's another phase after that, which is planetary independence, which is where we become so synchronized in mind and ability and evolution that we are able to essentially generate our own, what would be called a collective frequency domain. You can think of it in a kind of comic book way. It's like creating our own dimension. It's not actually that really. Well, it's more complicated. But we're creating our own collective frequency domain where we can exist in a world that is generated by us, and us as a subnetwork mind of the minds that have evolved on Earth. Now that would be a world that we, as this collective mind, would be the only ones experiencing. But for us, it is real, and for anyone else that is interacting in it, it is real as well. So the whole point is that in a certain level, depending on how you're defining it, everything is either a hallucination or it's real, depending on how one defines it. Because this is where the problem of human language comes in. What is reality? Reality is mental mathematical frequency. That's what it is. It's signals and data. That signals and data can be interpreted in different ways. We are all interpreting the signals and data of the world around us right now. Someone who is hallucinating is also interpreting signals and data, but they're the only ones receiving those signals and data. But that signal and data, those signals and data, that exists. It still exists. So it's really not a matter of is something real or is something hallucination. It's a matter of who is experiencing what. How many people are experiencing and agreeing on the collective objectivity of a certain experience. And that might sometimes seem hard to wrap your mind around, but it's always, I think VR is a great analogy. You put on the VR headset. Is that VR headset real? Well, in a certain sense, is that world real? Well, in a certain sense, it is. You're receiving all the data from it, and the people in that world playing the game with you, it's very real for them. They're all receiving that data. Well, what about this objective reality? Is this objective reality real? Well, we are all, as minds, linked to brains and nervous systems and avatars that give us the signals to experience this collective reality together. So the ultimate thing to do is really understand that the idea of, say, like hallucination and real is very limited by human language. It's not to really understand what reality is. You just have to understand what existence is. Existence is fundamentally mind. That's what it is. Everything is mind, just in a different transformation. Your body is mind, but it's configured in a very specific way to allow you to have a very specific experience of the space-time domain around you. And the data that you receive is very different than, say, the data that a bee receives or a bat receives. They all have different sensory apparatus, sending them different signals. And so ultimately, reality is mind. And we are experiencing this world around us as the environment through which we can interact. Is it real? Well, yeah. I mean, it's very real. But it's not material. It's not matter. It's mind. So if in your definition that makes reality hallucination, then it would. But it is very, very real. It's not anything that's fake. It's not anything that's non-existent. It's just a difference in the substance that makes it up. And that's what's really important to understand, because a lot of times our language has evolved to reflect a very basic understanding of existence. Remember, we're stepping into a new awareness, hyper-awareness. And so we have to develop new words to explain reality, because the words that we have to work with were built on a very low form of consciousness, just basically self-awareness. So all the words that we have are words will always be limited, but especially the words that we have right now are very, very limited. So this existence that we exist in together, it's not a material existence, and the brain is not generated from the mind. This existence is a mental existence. And this is what allows us to understand how reality operates, that we aren't our bodies, we aren't our brains, that we are eternal monadic minds, that our bodies are just what allow us to interact and explore in this world together. And what's important to understand about that is because when we know this and we understand this, that's why we can be able to build a better world together. We can understand that the reality isn't meaningless, it's not nihilistic, it's not purposeless. You see how it all leads to nihilism, especially materialism. Oh, you're nothing. You're just a random accident. You're a tiny speck on a planet that doesn't matter. Your consciousness of what you are, that's just an hallucination. It doesn't even exist. No. What's true is that you and us and all of us are the beating heart of existence, and we are the reason for why anything else is here, because ultimately this reality is reliant upon our internal frequency patterns. This reality, just like a personal dream is derived from your frequency patterns, your personal frequency patterns, your personal mind, this reality is derived from our collective frequency patterns, our collective mind. And that's why a dream world is unstable and shifts and changes dependent on your emotions and your thoughts and your feelings. You're having a dream world that's going to be shifting and changing depending on how you're feeling and what you're thinking, because it's composed of your mind. This reality is composed of all our minds. So because we're all making a contribution to it, each one of our contributions being an infinitesimal contribution, it's not going to change based on our emotions or feelings. It's going to be stable and consistent. So this is a collective reality is a long, consistent, stable dream that we all take part in. And ultimately what we are here to do is transform the world, transform ourselves, transform the universe. That is what we're here to do. And some of us are starting to wake up and realize that. And that's what we are here to do, is have humanity wake up and realize that as well. If you like this video, like and subscribe. I have a lot more videos on my channel that, because there's a lot to this. Obviously, I can't pack all the information in one video. Check out my channel. There's a lot of videos on this. You're going to find information here. Then this is about bringing knowledge to everyone, making this knowledge accessible to everyone so that we can build a better world. If you enjoy my work, if you ever feel like you've learned something or gotten something from my work, consider supporting on Patreon. Seriously, it really helps. That's how I'm able to do my work, do my videos, reach more people, have a roof over my head, all that. You get access to our weekly secret live streams, our hidden Discord server, the Citadel. We're having a secret live stream right after this. And I want to give a big shout out to everyone who does support on Patreon, especially Zach, Renaissance Fairy, Cassidy, Michael, Angela, Maria, Top of the World, Ethan, DB, and Joel, and everyone else. You're all awesome. The link will pop up right over here. Thank you very much.